We are very impressed by the quality of the dialogue, as far as we can see, between the Kazakhstani authorities and the foreign counterparts. There is a huge determination by the authorities to make sure that Kazakhstan is not helping circumvent those sanctions. I would say that inflation is not behind us or behind Kazakhstan, so to speak, yet. So one specific reform that we think is priority in Kazakhstan is privatization. The state and especially the public enterprises still have a very large presence in the economy. We think the banking system is solid at the moment, so it's a good basis. At the same time, there are institutional improvements to be made. Central bank independence is sort of a core pillar of an effective inflation targeting regime. In the case of Kazakhstan, we do see room for improvement.
Welcome to the Astana Times YouTube channel. I'm Aida Haidar. I'm joined together with Nicolas Blancher, the IMF Mission Chief for Kazakhstan. Thank you, Mr. Blancher. Welcome to Astana again. I want to ask you, first of all, can you provide us with the overview of the economy of Kazakhstan, considering the internal and global factors?
Good morning, Aida. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to discuss our findings from our Article 4 mission, which just ended today. We spent a couple of weeks in Kazakhstan and we discussed with a lot of counterparts. So we have a good and updated picture on the situation. So in terms of the growth outlook, to your question, what we see this year is growth is relatively strong, above 4.5%. We expect it actually to be 4.8 for this year, which is a relatively high level. And we expect that growth may slow down a little bit next year because of lower expected oil production in the country. We still don't have the full numbers, so I don't want to give a specific number yet, but it will be probably lower than it was this year. And then looking forward in the future or the medium term, we do see growth remaining in around 3 to 3.5%. That's our projection as regards non-oil growth. Of course, oil can fluctuate, so it could be higher on total growth or lower, but overall, on average, we see what we call the potential growth for the economy to be around 3 to 3.5%. Now, this is what we call our baseline projections. There are, of course, a number of risks to this, which have to do, like you said, to the global external context or to the domestic situation. What we see as the key risks have to do with oil in particular. I mean, the global oil market is obviously subject to potentially large variations on the oil price. So this affects directly Kazakhstan and could affect its external revenues. We also see potential risks in terms of disruption of oil exports. The channels for exports are not very diversified yet, so there is a need to do more of that, and the authorities are aiming to do that. But still, there is a risk of disruption. Another external risk has to do with the global environment, which is pretty uncertain at this point. We have a lot of uncertainties. The financial conditions at the global level have been tightening a lot, of course, with higher interest rates globally, and the economy is not immune from that. So there are potential impact of it going forward. Maybe more on the domestic side, I would say that inflation is not behind us or behind Kazakhstan, so to speak, yet. It's still above 10%. We hope it will be around 10.2 next month at the end of the year, but it could be higher. And if it's higher, it's a concern, of course, in general for the economy, but it's also a concern for social discontent potentially. So that could be a source of risk, and we have seen it in the past. And that's why it's also important to continue to make sure inflation continues to decline. I think these are the main risks. Longer term, there are risks related to climate change for Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is still an undiversified economy, relies a lot on fossil fuel resources. So over time, this will have to adjust to maintain the growth in the economy. So reforms will be needed for that. And should such decarbonization, as we say, accelerate, this could be a risk factor for the transition. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, seeing this risk, I would say that Kazakhstan is in a relatively good position because it has good buffers, it has strong reserves, it has strong what we call policy space, so fiscal buffers, if you want, or reserves to react to shocks, as it has done in the recent years with COVID and the war in Ukraine. So we think these are risks. Kazakhstan can tackle them, prepare for them, and and it's important to do that. Finally, I want to mention upside risks. There are upside risks. This 3 to 3.5% of growth potential that I mentioned could be higher if reforms are stronger, more decisive, more rapid. This could elevate that level of what we call potential growth, and then it could get closer to what the president has announced and the country is aspiring for, which is closer to 5 or maybe more. But that will take accelerated reforms. Of course, another positive upside risk could be a higher oil price, and these are the main risks we see.
But are there any areas when you see positive changes when you look at the June consultations?
Sure, we can talk about this. Maybe I can talk to you about the specific areas which we prioritize for this consultation. One of it was what we called FSAP. So FSAP means Financial Sector Assessment Program. So I had a colleague from our Monetary and Capital Markets Department who visited Kazakhstan this year with a large team of experts, and they spent a lot of time talking to the agency in Almaty, to the central bank, and to other counterparts to do an in-depth assessment of the financial sector. They have come up with detailed recommendations on how to, first, to assess the health of the financial system, which happens to be a positive assessment. We think the banking system is solid at the moment, so it's a good basis. At the same time, there are institutional improvements to be made, especially to the supervisory framework, so bank regulation framework in general, but also very much to the bank resolution framework. So in case banks fail or are in distress, countries need the systems, the arrangements, the laws to deal with that. In the past, Kazakhstan has dealt with this by relying a lot on what we call public bailouts, which is using taxpayer money basically to restructure and to recapitalize or to save the banks. This is not a good practice, and all countries are striving to avoid that. And so one of the key contributions of this FSAP was to help identify the key areas for progress in that area. Maybe two more issues I want to mention as focus this time around. One is not new, it's inflation. Our last mission was at the time when inflation was running high, so we had a strong focus on it and concern about it. Now the NBK took strong action. At the end of 2022, the policy interest rate was raised significantly, and that has helped. It has helped because we see this year that inflation is decreasing. It has peaked in February. It is now much lower. Our only recommendation, but I think we are very much aligned with what the thinking is at the NBK, is to remain cautious. There is a lot of uncertainty, as I mentioned. There are some reforms underway, such as the tariffs, domestic tariffs of energy that are changing. So this could add some inflation pressures and inflation expectations. That is the perception in the public and the markets of what inflation could be in the year to come are still elevated. So this has to be anchored. So that's why we say, and we agree with the NBK, that monetary policy should remain tight until this is more, on the radar, that convergence to the target being 5%. So that's sort of, and then finally, structural reforms. So the last area of focus for our visit this time has been the structural reform agenda. Again, going back to the need to elevate growth. After several, IMF visits in the recent years, I would say, I think we have a pretty good view on what needs to improve. And I mentioned it this morning. We think the role of the private sector should be elevated to drive growth and future, competitiveness and diversification. And for this, we think a priority, not just in Kazakhstan, but in many emerging and developing economies, is to reduce the role of the state, to give space to private entrepreneurs, to foreign investors, to come and bring, improvements. So for this, there are some key reform priorities, what we call often first-generation reforms, which have to do with rethinking the role of the state, reducing it when it needs to be, refocusing it, maybe less pervasive subsidies across the board, but maybe more targeted interventions, and also very much improving the governance of the public sector, being transparent, being predictable. All of these are conditions for stability, and stability, including macro stability, is the foundation for future growth. So that's how we see it. Now, this is a bit general, I realize. At the same time, we have done some specific work because we want to be useful. We just don't want to come here and give, general recommendations that may apply everywhere. We have done some specific analysis and assessment of key reforms priorities for Kazakhstan. And I want to show you a paper that we finished over the last summer, which is exactly about that. It's about the region, so all countries in the Caucasus and Central Asia region, but also very much Kazakhstan. We think that this is identifying what are the key specific reform initiatives that could be taken that could yield significant growth benefits. If all of them, and we identify maybe 6 or 7, if all of them were done by magic tomorrow, we see potential could be close to what the president has announced, which is 6%. Of course, it's hard to imagine that can be done so fast, but at least it gives the direction. And again, public governance reforms are coming up as the top item for quick gains. That's the point also. It's not just reforms to get growth in 10 years. It's also the types of reforms that can yield benefits rapidly.
Could you identify one of them, the ones that are in this paper?
Sure. So one specific reform that we think is priority in Kazakhstan is privatization. The state and especially the public enterprises still have a very large presence in the economy, not just through ownership of the economy, but also through regulations and sort of governance or monopolies sometimes. I mean, we talk to the competition agency, for example, in Kazakhstan. They have a great diagnosis about in which sectors are the monopolies. Starting to address this privatization and privatizing more rapidly than what we have seen so far. I mean, there is scope to accelerate surely this part of the reform agenda. We think that could help a lot in Kazakhstan because of the characteristics of the economy.
Mm-hmm. And let me go back to the June mission, because the IMF a few months back raised concerns about the substantial expansion of public spending in 2023. What are the IMF recommendations on this following the results of this month review? So
as it turns out, the last fiscal data that we got in this mission show that public spending has indeed expanded significantly this year, like we were expecting in June. But at the same time, we also saw that public revenues, have been overperforming by far what we were expecting. So in that sense, the budget balance, if you want, is more or less what we initially expected. However, there is a broader concern that we have, that a lot of public spending is happening outside the budget. And I think that's one of the areas where we want to focus on our advice also. A lot of entities like, for example, public enterprises or even the NBK have programs to do what we call quasi-fiscal activities or spending. And that's not in the budget. That's not subject to oversight by parliament, for example. But this is big. This can be big. And we saw it this year, for example, through operations of the National Fund of the Republic of Kazakhstan. Mm-hmm. Some of these resources are used for some operations that do not appear in the budget and can be big. We actually have currently a big operation related to Kaizmunaygas shares changing ownership. So we think this makes it more complicated to have a clear view on the fiscal policy, and we think this is something that should be addressed because it raised the risk that public spending could be too strong and then undermine the fiscal discipline that that needs to be in place, including to support this inflation. If you spend too much and at some point it doesn't create growth, it just creates inflation because the economy cannot take it. So we think it's important to have that clarity on that. And one last point on this, which has to do with the role of fiscal rules. Kazakhstan has fiscal rules in place. They have been improved over the years. Now, this year they were suspended. They are expected to be reinstated next year in 2024. We are strongly of the view that it is important to indeed reinstate them next year, again, for that discipline. But we are even more of the view that these rules should be improved. They are complex. There are many of them. It's not always clear how they are functioning and how they are consistent among all of them, even if there are two main ones. But maybe even more importantly, we are strongly encouraging, in addition to the rules, that you can have rules and they cannot just be ignored. So it's important to have some more institutional control of that and the compliance of the rules. And we are advising for the creation of a fiscal council, which would be independent, to which the state would report about the use of all the public resources and to make sure it's compliant with the principle of the rules. And the same thing with escape clause. What we call escape clause is that there are some circumstances like COVID where it's justified. It's the society accepts to circumvent the rules because it's an emergency like COVID. So in those cases, there could be escape clauses, but this should be clearly defined. they should not leave too much space for discretion. And we think they do currently leave too much space for discretion.
In your opinion, National Bank of Kazakhstan's commitment to inflation targeting it, what further steps would the IMF recommend to take to enhance credibility and independence of the NBK?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. We, of course, that's an area where we do have expertise and can help a lot, and we have a very good dialogue on this issue. Overall, I would say that the inflation targeting regime has served Kazakhstan very well, especially in recent years. The economy has been subject to large shocks, including external shocks. COVID was an obvious one. We had the war in Ukraine and the potential for sanctions. And in all these cases, you will notice that the exchange rate basically played its role. It adjusted, it allowed to absorb the shock, and then it came back. So we think that's exactly the role that an exchange rate should have to absorb external shocks. Now, how to improve that regime, in addition to this role of the exchange rate? We think there are structural factors, some of which are beyond the control of the NBK itself, but that need to be thought through, and they are by the authorities, of course. One has to do with de-dollarization. You have more control of your monetary aggregates if you have less currency substitution to dollar. Another aspect is to develop capital markets, because the more capital markets are developed, the more your transmission of your monetary policy and policy rate change to the economy is happening efficiently. And then, like you said, there is the issue of central bank independence. Now, central bank independence is sort of a core pillar of an effective inflation targeting regime. In the case of Kazakhstan, we do see room for improvement. Now, one of the ways we see that is that at the IMF we have, I don't know if it's a database or let's say we have expertise. We have actually several experts working on central banks' legal frameworks, and we compare. We are able to compare good practice in Canada, in Chile, and in Kazakhstan. So we are bringing that perspective. Now, when we look at the legal framework for the NBK and its mandate and its sort of the pillars of independence, we see that there are gaps. So our advice is to maybe think a little bit more on how to fill those gaps. This is not to say that anything can happen. It's of course the authorities have been behaving, as I said, extremely well, including in the face of the shocks. But at least for the perception of the markets and to align with good international practice and to support the confidence in the inflation targeting regime, it's good to have that inscribed in the law. And that goes to the functional independence of the NBK. I mean, there are several pillars, but in the two that come to mind in the case of Kazakhstan are the functional independence, meaning the NBK should have all the latitude it needs to use its instrument to reach its mandate. So the mandate is decided by society, but how to reach it should be left to the NBK, including the level of the policy interest rate, to reach that mandate, which is price stability. And the second one is personal independence. It's important that there are, I would say, legal protection for senior NBK officials, including the governor, for them to do their job independently and not be dismissed without proper motivation in the light of the law. And this is typically what the legal mandates of central banks provide for. We don't have that in Kazakhstan. So our advice would be to strengthen that legal aspect to help further increase the credibility of the monetary policy.
So inflation is not behind us yet, even though it went down significantly. But there are many conversations about inflation being still high and the loans for private business and for corporate business not as affordable as one would wish them to be. In your opinion, what can be done, what kind of recommendations would IMF give to Kazakhstan to balance that, the targeting inflation with economic growth?
You're right that there is a trade-off, in a sense, between the level of interest rates, meaning lending rates, because there is transmission, and the growth. In the short term, there is a trade-off. If you raise your interest rate very high, it will hurt growth. The question is, what is the priority? What we want is long-term growth. One of the foundational conditions for long-term growth is macroeconomic stability, price stability, and the confidence that goes with that for investors and for the public, anybody. For us, the priority is to make sure that inflation is controlled. for these benefits. Of course, inflation is also a tax on the poor. So in itself, it's important to protect the living standards and limit it. But to your question, it's important to have low inflation to allow for investment and to grow the economy. That's where growth comes from. And so that's the longer term aspect of it. In the short term, yes, it is difficult to raise interest rates. It's hurting growth and lending, but it's for the greater good, because you create the conditions for future good lending opportunities and investment opportunities. So in a sense, the important thing here is to limit the pain. In a sense, in the short term, you have to do what needs to be done to control inflation. It may require higher interest rates, like we have seen at the end of last year. The point is to be what we say ahead of the curve, not do it too late. The more you wait to do it, the more it's going to be painful, because you're going to have to react more. So it's important to be ahead of the curve. I think the NBK has been on top of this again at the end of last year and this year. This is helping a lot. This is laying the foundation for future. Now, in the future, inflation will be controlled, policy rates will go down, lending rates will go down. So that's enough. Now, if you see that lending rates remain high even when
inflation goes down,
and policy rates go down, then there is another question. Is there competition in the system? I mean, if there is good competition, banks should compete for clients, and that should drive lending rates down closer to the policy rate. So I think this goes into the more structural issues of competition in the system, existence of profitable borrowers in the economy, and this is a huge agenda which goes back to the reforms we talked about, giving space to entrepreneurs and all these things.
Maybe our president, it wasn't by chance that he said our banking sector should be more open to other international banks coming to Kazakhstan.
That's part of this. Fully agree.
Let's move to the recommendations by the IMF in terms of improving revenue administration and non-oil revenue collection, and how they align with the government's medium-term fiscal commitment.
The starting point here is that fiscal revenues in Kazakhstan are not very high. When you compare, tax revenues in particular to GDP, it's not very high. That's why we are supportive of the current reform, including to increase the VAT rate, as we discussed before. Now, in terms of revenue collection specifically, one thing we are really supportive of and commending the authorities for is their effort at digitalization. The revenue collection, this is yielding significant benefits in terms of the efficiency of the tax collection year after year. We see it, and it supports the increase in that collection. We are also helping on the IMF side. We have been proposing to the authorities to have what we call a compliance risk management, because it's good to reform your taxes, but you want to make sure people comply and pay the taxes. So that's the administrative part of complying with the tax payments. So here we have some help to provide. We are working with the State Revenue Committee and to improve those systems to achieve that. And I think this is going. All of this progressing in the good direction will be a key aspect of the fiscal consolidation, to your question.
And the last question, I wanted to ask you about the risk of secondary sanctions and what kind of recommendations IMF made maybe about avoiding them and securing the financial stability and security.
Yeah. So our view on sanctions is, it's not really our focus as an economic institution. We're not directly concerned by the political dimension of it, if you want. We look at the economic implications. What I would say is that we are very impressed by the quality of the dialogue, as far as we can see, between the Kazakhstani authorities and the foreign counterparts from the EU, US, and others. We see that there is a constant dialogue. There is a huge determination by the authorities to make sure that Kazakhstan is not helping circumvent those sanctions. So in itself, it's a very good signal that they do what it takes to avoid falling under secondary sanctions. Now, in particular, this is clear in terms of monitoring trade flows. There are a lot of sanctioned entities, persons, companies, and currencies for transactions that are being affected by sanctions. And again, the way the authorities have put in place systems to monitor those flows, including on specific sanction items, is very good, and I think has been recognized by others. Another aspect of it, finally, has to do with the banking system. What we have seen on our side is that the authorities, again, I'm thinking the Agency for Financial Regulation in Almaty, is very much looking at what banks are doing. Banks themselves are very careful in terms of regulatory compliance and compliance with the sanctions. One of the reasons being that they want to maintain their correspondent banking relationships. So if they have such a relationship with a big, let's say, Western bank, they want to make sure they keep the business. And for this, they are subject to scrutiny by their partner in the West, let's say. So I think this is also a big source of compliance, and this is all welcome also on the side of the financial system. So that's it. I think, I'm confident the authorities will continue to do what it takes to limit the risk. One never knows, but at least they do what's needed.
Thank you very much for your time. Again, it was a very insightful conversation.
Thank you very much.